The house was supposed to be the safest place on earth. A $13.5 million estate in Brentwood. Tall gates, manicured hedges, quiet streets where nothing ever really happens. A place designed to keep the outside world out. So here's the question that stopped investigators cold. What if the most dangerous secret in this entire case wasn't inside the mansion at all, but buried beneath it? Let that sink in. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because when federal agents began digging below the foundation of Rob Reiner's home, they weren't looking for a headline. They weren't chasing rumors. They weren't even sure what they would find. But what they allegedly uncovered forced them to rethink everything. Not just the crime. Not just the timeline. Not just the people involved. Everything. And before we go any further, let me ask you something directly. How well do you really know the places you trust the most? We all assume danger looks a certain way. Dark alleys, abandoned buildings, seedy locations far from our lives. But history keeps proving something far more unsettling. Some of the darkest secrets are hidden in plain sight, beneath luxury, beneath respectability, beneath homes that look perfect from the outside. This story matters now because it isn't just about what happened in that mansion. It's about what may have been hidden there long before the night everything exploded into violence. The official story, at least at first, sounded tragic but contained. A family destroyed, a son arrested, a horrific act of violence inside a private residence. End of story. Except it wasn't. Because almost immediately, there were signs that this case wasn't going to stay simple. Investigators noticed inconsistencies. Subtle ones. Easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. Renovations that didn't line up with records. Structural features that raised quiet questions. Areas of the property that didn't quite make sense on the blueprints. At first, those details sat in the background. Footnotes. Loose ends. Until they weren't. Because once the FBI became involved, the focus shifted. This was no longer just about what happened inside the house. It became about what the house itself might have been hiding. Think about that for a moment. Homes don't just shelter people. They hold history. They absorb secrets. They become silent witnesses to things no one ever expects to surface. And sometimes, those secrets don't stay buried. When news broke that federal agents were examining areas beneath the mansion, the public reaction was immediate. Confusion, shock, skepticism. Why dig? Why now? What could possibly be under a luxury estate that would justify such an escalation? That's where this story begins to change shape. Because buried items don't happen by accident. No one accidentally hides something underground, seals it, and walks away. Burial is deliberate. It's intentional. It's a choice made when someone wants something out of sight, but not destroyed. Preserved, but hidden. Forgotten, but retrievable. Ask yourself this. Why hide something instead of throwing it away? Why keep it close, but invisible? That question sits at the heart of everything that followed. According to early investigative findings, what was discovered beneath the property wasn't random debris or leftover construction material. These weren't scraps. They weren't trash. They weren't meaningless. They were objects. Personal ones. Items that carried weight. Items that didn't belong underground. Items that raised an immediate and deeply unsettling possibility. That someone, at some point, wanted these things hidden forever. And that's when the narrative cracked open. Because once you accept that something was intentionally concealed beneath the mansion, you're forced to ask a far more dangerous question. What was it hiding from? Time? Police? The public? Or the truth? Here's where the story takes a darker turn. Some of the objects allegedly recovered didn't just look old. They felt out of place. Linked, possibly, to a case that never fully closed. A name that faded from headlines years ago. A mystery that quietly slipped into the category of unresolved. You know the kind. The ones people stop talking about not because they're solved, but because they're uncomfortable. The ones that linger in the background of true crime forums, half remembered and rarely revisited. The ones that resurface only when something forces them back into the light. Could this discovery be doing exactly that? Investigators reportedly didn't rush to announce what they found, and that silence mattered. Because law enforcement doesn't go quiet when they're unsure. They go quiet when they're concerned. Silence is strategy. Silence means they're connecting dots. Silence means someone is about to be very uncomfortable. And here's another question worth sitting with. If these items were buried years ago, maybe even decades ago, Who knew about them? Was it one person acting alone? Or was this a secret shared, protected by silence and time? Family dynamics matter here, not in a sensational way, but in a human one. Families are ecosystems. Secrets don't exist in isolation. They ripple. They shape behavior. They influence decisions. They create tension long before they explode. What if the violence that brought investigators to this property wasn't the beginning of the story, but the end of it? What if everything that happened above ground was the result of something buried long ago? This is why the FBI's involvement changes everything. Federal agencies don't dig beneath mansions for curiosity's sake. They dig when there's reason to believe something bigger is at play, something that extends beyond a single night, something that might involve patterns, concealment, or even prior knowledge. And that brings us to the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the ground beneath that house holds more than one secret? What if this wasn't a one-time act of hiding, but part of a larger effort to keep something out of sight? Every investigation has a moment where the story shifts. A line that, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. For this case, that moment may not have been the arrest, or the charges, or even the crime itself. It may have been the sound of tools breaking through concrete. Because once you start digging, you can't pretend you don't want answers. And answers have a way of demanding more questions. As we move forward, we're going to walk step by step through what led investigators to look beneath the mansion in the first place. The history of the property, the changes that raised eyebrows, the clues that didn't make sense until they were viewed through a different lens. We're going to talk about why people bury secrets instead of destroying them. We're going to examine what personal objects can reveal about the past, especially when they surface where they never should have been. And we're going to confront the possibility that this case isn't just about a family tragedy, but about something older, deeper, and far more disturbing. Because once the concrete was breached, investigators realized something chilling. This wasn't just a crime scene anymore. It was a map, and what it might be pointing to could change everything. What if the house itself was trying to tell investigators something? That was the question quietly circulating once the concrete was breached and the realization set in that this wasn't just a crime scene anymore. It was a map, not a literal one with lines and labels, but a structural story written into walls, permits, and renovations that didn't quite add up. Because when you zoom out, when you stop looking only at what happened inside the mansion and start looking at the mansion itself, something uncomfortable emerges. Homes don't accidentally become puzzles. And this one, according to investigators, had too many pieces that didn't fit. This is where we begin to rewind. Not to the night of the violence, not to the arrest, but further back, years back, to the building itself. The mansion wasn't always what it appeared to be in glossy real estate photos. It evolved, slowly, quietly, layer by layer, renovation by renovation. Each change justified on paper, but together forming a pattern that, in hindsight, feels almost intentional. Let me ask you this. How often do you really question renovations in wealthy homes? People expect luxury properties to change, to expand, to modernize. New wings, reinforced foundations, upgraded utilities. No one bats an eye when a multi-million-dollar estate files permits for construction work. It's normal, routine, boring even. That's what makes it such a perfect cover. According to records reviewed by investigators, the property underwent multiple phases of construction over the years. Some large, some minor, some described vaguely enough that you'd skim right past them if you weren't looking for something specific. Reinforcement work, subsurface improvements, structural adjustments. All reasonable on their own. But together, they started to raise questions. Because certain areas of the property showed signs of work that didn't match their stated purpose. Concrete thicker than necessary. Sections sealed off in ways that weren't architecturally required. Spaces beneath the home that weren't clearly defined on original blueprints, but existed in reality. Here's the contradiction that made investigators pause. Luxury homes are designed to maximize space, light, and openness. Builders want every square foot to serve a purpose that adds value. Storage rooms are accessible. Utility spaces are standardized. There's a logic to it. But this house had areas that didn't follow that logic. Hidden voids don't increase property value. They increase secrecy. And secrecy always begs the same question. Why? Neighbors reportedly described the estate as quiet. Private. Nothing unusual. No obvious signs of construction chaos beyond what you'd expect during permitted work. Contractors came and went. Materials were delivered. Everything looked legitimate from the outside. And that's the point. The most effective hiding places don't look suspicious. They look normal. Investigators began piecing together timelines. When renovations occurred, who signed off on them? Which contractors were involved? What materials were used? Where they were placed? This wasn't about accusing anyone yet. It was about understanding intent. Because buildings, like people, leave traces of decision-making. And the house was making a statement. One investigator reportedly described it this way. The structure felt layered, like chapters written on top of one another. Each renovation didn't erase the previous one. It concealed it. Think about that. Instead of removing or redesigning old spaces, new construction seemed to bury them. Literally, concrete poured where access once existed. Walls built in front of older walls. Corridors shortened. Entry points eliminated. It's not how homes are usually upgraded. It's how spaces are hidden. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. Who plans a house like that? Not someone thinking about resale value. Not someone thinking about comfort. Someone thinking about control. Someone thinking about keeping something where they can monitor it without anyone else knowing it's there. This is where the idea of the house as a map becomes unavoidable. Every sealed space tells a story. Every reinforced slab marks a decision point. Every alteration suggests a moment when someone chose concealment over transparency. And when federal agents began tracing those decisions backward, the timeline didn't align neatly with the crime everyone was focused on. Some of the work dated back much earlier, years earlier, long before the events that brought police to the property. That's a chilling realization. Because it means whatever was hidden beneath the mansion may not have been connected to the immediate violence in the way people assumed. It may have been waiting, dormant, buried in both a physical and psychological sense. Let me ask you directly, if something has been hidden for years, why does it surface now? The answer is rarely coincidence. Often, it's pressure, a breaking point, a moment when the system that kept the secret intact finally collapses. And systems always collapse from the inside. Investigators reportedly noted that the subsurface areas showed signs of intentional planning. Not rushed, not sloppy, not panicked. This wasn't the work of someone improvising after the fact. It looked deliberate, measured, almost patient. That detail matters more than people realize. Because panic leads to mistakes. Haste leaves evidence. But patience allows secrets to survive. And yet, here we are. The secrecy failed. Something forced the truth upward. Which brings us to another unsettling layer of this story. If the house was altered to hide something, then the house wasn't just a passive backdrop. It was an active participant, a collaborator in concealment. That reframes everything. It suggests intent embedded in architecture. It suggests foresight. It suggests that whoever made these changes expected scrutiny someday and planned around it. But here's the contradiction that keeps surfacing. If someone was this careful, this methodical, why leave anything behind at all? Why not destroy whatever needed hiding? Why preserve it? That question led investigators into dangerous territory. Because preservation implies meaning. You don't preserve things you're indifferent to. You preserve what matters. What holds power? What you might need someday. That's why buried objects are often more revealing than destroyed ones. Destruction erases. Burial remembers. And according to those familiar with the investigation, the layout beneath the mansion didn't feel like storage. It felt like containment. A space designed not just to hold objects, but to isolate them. To keep them separate from daily life, while still under control. That's a psychological red flag. Containment is about fear, about consequences, about not wanting something to disappear completely, but not wanting it to exist openly either. Ask yourself, what kind of secret lives in that space between? As investigators continued mapping the structure, one particular area drew intense focus. A section beneath the home that wasn't easily accessible. Not because it was collapsed or damaged, but because access had been intentionally eliminated. Entry points sealed. Pathways removed. No obvious reason for it to exist unless it served a purpose no one wanted documented. And that's when the story took another turn. Because blueprints don't lie. But they can omit. Comparing original plans with the current structure revealed discrepancies. Small ones, but consistent. Spaces that appeared on early designs but vanished in later revisions without explanation. Areas that should have been opened but weren't. You don't accidentally erase rooms. You choose to. At this stage, investigators weren't just looking at evidence. They were reading intent. And the intent suggested long-term secrecy. Which brings us back to the most disturbing implication so far. If the house was altered to hide something years ago, and that secret remained buried until now, then the events that triggered the dig may not have been the cause of the secret, but the consequence of it. Let that idea sit with you. What if the violence wasn't the beginning of the story, but the moment the past finally demanded attention? What if the secret beneath the mansion didn't just exist quietly, but exerted pressure over time? Pressure that shaped relationships, fueled tension, influenced decisions behind closed doors. Homes absorb stress. They hold arguments in their walls. They trap silences in their floors. And sometimes, when those pressures build long enough, something breaks. This chapter matters because it reframes the narrative. It asks us to stop seeing the mansion as a neutral location and start seeing it as a character. One with a history. One with motives embedded in concrete and steel. And here's the part that should unsettle you the most. Investigators reportedly believe the house wasn't hiding something random. It was hiding something specific. Something chosen. Something someone didn't want found, but couldn't let go of. As the mapping continued, attention shifted from structure to contents. From walls to what they protected. Because once you understand how carefully something was hidden, the next question becomes unavoidable. What was worth that level of effort? And more importantly, who was it meant to be hidden from? Because when the house finally gave up its secrets, it didn't do so gently. It pointed investigators towards something buried on purpose. And once they realized that, they knew the next step would change the case entirely. Because uncovering what was hidden beneath the mansion would force them to confront not just what happened, but why it was hidden in the first place. And that brings us to the moment everything shifted again. Because the first object recovered wasn't just old. It was personal. And it shouldn't have been there. What if the first thing they uncovered wasn't evidence, but a message? That was the uneasy feeling investigators couldn't shake as the dig continued beneath the mansion. Because once you accept that the house itself was part of the concealment, every object recovered stops being just an object. It becomes intentional, symbolic, chosen. And the first item to emerge from beneath the concrete didn't feel random at all. It felt personal. Ask yourself this before we go any further. If you were hiding something underground, something you never wanted discovered, would you start with items that meant nothing to you? Of course not. You'd hide what mattered. What scared you? What could unravel everything if it ever saw the light of day? That's why the discovery that came next forced investigators to slow down, reassess, and, according to those familiar with the process, quietly widen the scope of their questions. Because this wasn't trash. This wasn't debris. This was something that once belonged to someone. And that detail changed everything. The object was reportedly found carefully wrapped, protected from moisture and time. Not tossed aside. Not broken. Preserved. Whoever buried it didn't want it destroyed. They wanted it hidden, but intact. That alone tells you a lot. People destroy what they want gone forever. They preserve what they're afraid to lose. And fear is a powerful motivator. As soon as the item was documented, a new kind of tension entered the investigation. Not urgency, not panic, but recognition. The quiet kind. The kind that happens when someone realizes they've seen something like this before. Because personal objects carry fingerprints in more ways than one. They tell stories. They anchor memories. They connect people across time. And sometimes, they tie directly into cases everyone thought were finished. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. How many unresolved cases do you think still exist, quietly sitting in files, waiting for the one detail that brings them back to life? Most people assume cold cases fade because there's nothing left to find. That's not always true. Sometimes they fade because the truth was deliberately buried. According to investigative sources, the item recovered beneath the mansion bore similarities to belongings referenced in a much older investigation. One that never reached a clean conclusion. One that slowly slipped out of public awareness without ever being truly resolved. Not because it a direction that pointed away from the present and towards something buried in time. And that's the part that should make you pause. Because if this discovery connects to a case that predates everything we thought this story was about, then the narrative everyone accepted may be incomplete. Or worse, incorrect. What if the violence that shocked the public wasn't the root of the story, but the breaking point of a long-buried secret finally forcing its way to the surface? What if the house didn't just hide objects, but history? That possibility changes how you see everything. It suggests that what happened above ground may have been shaped by what was hidden below it. That secrets don't stay quiet forever. They wait. And when they resurface, they don't just reveal themselves. They demand reckoning. As investigators prepared to move deeper into the buried area, one thing became clear. These items were only the beginning. Because the way they were arranged suggested something else existed nearby. Something larger. Something even more difficult to explain. And if that next discovery confirmed their suspicions, it wouldn't just complicate the case. It would redefine it. Because the ground beneath the mansion hadn't finished telling its story. And what it was about to reveal would force everyone involved to confront a truth no one was ready for. What if the case everyone forgot wasn't forgotten at all? What if it was waiting? That was the question investigators couldn't escape once the first set of personal items was cataloged and cross-referenced. Because the moment those objects were matched against old descriptions, old notes, old half-finished reports, the past stopped feeling distant. It felt close. Too close. Cold cases have a reputation. People imagine dusty files, faded photos, leads that ran dry decades ago. They assume time erases urgency. That silence means nothing is there. But silence doesn't always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means pressure building. This is where the investigation took a turn that no one outside a small circle of officials initially understood. Because what investigators were quietly revisiting wasn't just a name or a date. It was a story that never reached an ending. A case that stalled, not because there was no evidence, but because momentum died. Witnesses moved on. Media attention shifted. Leads cooled just enough for the world to forget. But forgetting doesn't mean resolving. And buried objects have a way of reopening doors people assumed were sealed. Let me ask you something. How many lives do you think are shaped by unresolved questions? Not just the victims, the families, the people who lived with uncertainty for years, who learned to survive without answers, who stopped expecting closure because it hurt less than hoping. Now imagine what it feels like to learn that pieces of that unanswered story were hidden beneath a stranger's home all along. That's the emotional weight investigators were dealing with as they dug deeper into records few people had looked at in years. The case they revisited didn't explode into headlines when it first happened. It simmered, a disappearance that didn't fit neatly into any category. No clear suspect, no definitive conclusion. Just enough unanswered questions to keep it technically open, but practically ignored. And now, suddenly, objects tied to that case were resurfacing in the most unlikely place. This wasn't coincidence. Investigators don't believe in coincidence, especially not when timelines overlap in uncomfortable ways. The more they examined the recovered items, the clearer it became that these weren't random belongings. They matched descriptions in old reports with unsettling accuracy. Items last seen in the possession of someone who vanished without explanation. Think about that. Someone disappears. Their belongings disappear with them. Years pass. No closure. No recovery. And then, buried beneath a mansion, fragments of their life reappear. What does that suggest to you? Because to investigators, it suggested proximity. Not just physical proximity, but involvement. Awareness. Knowledge that goes beyond chance. And here's where the story gets darker. The older case didn't just fade because there were no leads. It faded because pursuing it became difficult. Witnesses became reluctant. Statements grew vague. Cooperation dried up. That's not how cases usually die. They die when there's nothing left to pursue. This one died when pursuing it became uncomfortable. Ask yourself why. Who benefits when a case stalls? Who breathes easier when questions stop being asked? Those are dangerous questions. And they're the kind that make people nervous when old files are reopened. As investigators revisited the case history, patterns emerged. Small details that felt insignificant years ago suddenly looked deliberate. Missed connections. Timelines that didn't quite align. Opportunities that were never fully explored. It wasn't negligence. It was absence. Absence of pressure. Absence of scrutiny. Absence of someone pushing hard enough to break through resistance. And now, buried objects were applying that pressure all over again. The emotional toll of reopening such cases can't be overstated. Investigators know they're not just chasing facts. They're reopening wounds. For families. For communities. For anyone connected to the original disappearance. But truth has its own gravity. Once it starts pulling, it doesn't let go easily. Let me ask you another question. If you were connected to an unresolved case from years ago, and you believed it was safely forgotten, how would you react to learning pieces of it had been uncovered beneath your home? Fear? Panic? Denial? Or silence? Silence is often the most telling response. As attention turned toward the old case, investigators began noticing overlaps they hadn't expected. Shared timelines. Geographic proximity. Moments where paths could have crossed. Nothing definitive, but enough to make coincidence feel unlikely. This is where contradictions started piling up. Public narratives had long treated the older case as isolated, a tragedy disconnected from anything else, a sad story without resolution. But the discovery beneath the mansion suggested a different possibility, that the case wasn't isolated at all. It was connected to people who moved on, who built lives, who lived comfortably while unanswered questions slept beneath concrete. That realization changes how you see everything, because it suggests that some secrets don't disappear. They get stored, hidden, managed, until something disrupts the balance. And disruptions have consequences. Investigators reportedly struggled with how to proceed, not because they lacked direction, but because of the magnitude of what reopening the case could mean. There were reputations involved, legacies, families who believed the past was behind them. Reopening old wounds doesn't just uncover truth. It creates fallout. But truth doesn't ask permission. As records were re-examined, one detail stood out above the rest. The original case ended not with answers, but with assumptions. Assumptions that no one challenged hard enough. Assumptions that became accepted over time simply because they were easier than uncertainty. And buried objects have a way of shattering assumptions. They force specificity, ownership, accountability. If an object belonged to someone who disappeared, then someone else had to possess it after the disappearance. That's not speculation. That's logic. Possession creates a timeline, a chain of custody, a sequence of decisions. And those decisions leave traces. Which brings us to another uncomfortable realization. The items weren't buried immediately after the disappearance. They were held for some period of time, which means someone lived with them, stored them, chose not to reveal them, and only later decided to hide them underground. Why wait? Why not bury them right away? Delay implies hesitation, conflict, fear. It implies someone wasn't sure what to do. That kind of uncertainty doesn't come from strangers. It comes from involvement, from proximity, from knowing too much. As investigators pieced together this timeline, the emotional tone of the investigation shifted. This was no longer just about connecting evidence. It was about confronting the idea that the past had been managed, not resolved. And management requires maintenance, silence, control, complicity. Ask yourself this. How many people does it take to keep a secret for years? Not everyone needs to know the full truth. Sometimes, all it takes is enough people knowing not to ask questions. Enough people benefiting from not knowing. Enough people choosing comfort over confrontation. And comfort is a powerful motivator. This is where the idea of a secret location beneath the mansion took on new meaning. It wasn't just a hiding place. It was a symbol of containment, of pushing something away without letting it go. And the unresolved case fit perfectly into that pattern. Something too dangerous to acknowledge openly, too significant to destroy. So it was buried, physically and figuratively. The deeper investigators went into the old files, the more they noticed what wasn't there. Missing follow-ups. Leads that were never pursued beyond a certain point. Witnesses who were never re-interviewed. It wasn't a cover-up in the dramatic sense people imagine. It was quieter, subtler, a slow fading of attention, which is often more effective. And now, attention was back. Focused, unforgiving. Here's the part that should unsettle you the most. If this older case is connected to what was hidden beneath the mansion, then the violence that shocked everyone may not have been random or isolated. It may have been influenced by pressure that had been building for years. Pressure from a secret that refused to stay buried. Pressure from fear of exposure. Pressure from knowing that one day, the ground might give way. Secrets don't just sit quietly forever. They rot. They destabilize. They poison relationships. And when they finally surface, they do so with force. As investigators prepared to take the next step, they faced a choice. Treat the buried items as anomalies, or treat them as keys. Keys to a door that had been locked for far too long. They chose the latter, and that decision would lead them to something even more difficult to explain. Because as they expanded the dig, attention shifted away from individual objects and toward the space itself. The layout, the containment, the possibility that this wasn't just about items, but about a place designed to hold them. A place no one was supposed to find. And if that place existed, then everything about this case was about to change. Because uncovering a secret room isn't just an architectural discovery. It's a confession written in concrete. And the walls beneath the mansion were about to start talking. What if the space itself was the secret? That was the thought hanging in the air as investigators shifted their focus away from the individual items and toward the structure that had hidden them. Because objects can be moved, buried, relocated. But spaces? Spaces are built. And you don't build something by accident. The idea of a hidden location beneath the mansion didn't start as a dramatic theory. It began as a practical question. A simple one. Where did these items come from? Not in an emotional sense. In a physical one. How were they placed here? How was access gained? And more importantly, how was that access removed? Those questions led investigators back to the layout beneath the house. Back to the sealed sections that didn't match any known purpose. Back to the architectural inconsistencies that had been bothering them since the dig began. This is where the tone of the investigation changed again. Because once you start considering the possibility of a deliberately concealed space, every detail becomes more ominous. The thickness of the concrete, the placement of load-bearing supports, the absence of access points where access should exist. Homes aren't built blindly. Every structural decision is intentional. Engineers don't add reinforced sections without reason. Builders don't close off usable space unless they're told to. And when investigators mapped the subsurface layout in detail, one area stood out immediately. It wasn't just sealed. It was isolated. Let me ask you something. Why isolate a space beneath your home? Not for storage. Storage needs access. Not for utilities. Utilities need maintenance. Not for safety. Safety spaces are clearly documented. Isolation serves one purpose: containment. According to those familiar with the investigation, this area beneath the mansion didn't connect naturally to any other subsurface space. It wasn't an extension. It wasn't a byproduct. It was its own zone, deliberately separated. And that raised a chilling possibility. What if this wasn't a hiding spot created in response to danger? What if it was designed long before danger ever arrived? Think about the mindset required to plan something like that. You don't wake up one day and decide to build a secret room beneath your home without a reason. It requires planning, coordination, money, and above all, foresight. You have to believe that secrecy will be necessary, that exposure will be dangerous, that the effort will be worth it. That's not panic. That's preparation. As investigators carefully expanded their examination of the sealed area, they noticed something else that didn't sit right. The construction quality. This wasn't sloppy work. This wasn't a rushed job. The materials used were consistent with professional construction. Reinforced, durable, designed to last. Someone didn't just want to hide this space temporarily. They wanted it to endure. Ask yourself why. What kind of secret needs a permanent home? As the possibility of a hidden room became more concrete, investigators began considering scenarios that went beyond simple storage. The layout suggested intentional design. A room-sized void, protected from moisture, shielded from casual discovery. Not just a hole, a place. That distinction matters, because places imply use. They imply purpose. They imply activity. And activity raises questions no one was ready to answer. Here's where the emotional weight of the investigation deepened. If this space existed, and if it was used, then the house wasn't just hiding evidence. It was facilitating secrecy. It was providing cover. And cover always serves someone. The question is who? Investigators reportedly debated whether to breach the sealed area immediately or continue documenting the surrounding structure. That hesitation wasn't procedural. It was psychological. Breaking into a hidden room isn't like opening a drawer. It's crossing a line. Once you do it, you can't pretend you didn't want to know what was inside. And everyone involved understood that whatever they found would force them to rethink the case yet again. Before the breach, they studied the space from every angle they could. Ground-penetrating scans, structural analysis, comparison with original plans. The results were unsettling. The room, if it existed, wasn't accounted for in early documentation. It appeared to have been incorporated during later renovations, disguised as reinforcement work. That means it wasn't part of the house's original design. It was added deliberately. Which brings us to another uncomfortable question. Why add a hidden room years after a house is built? What changes in someone's life prompt that decision? Fear, guilt, anticipation of scrutiny, or knowledge that something dangerous already existed? There's a common belief that secrets come from bad actions. But often, secrets come from fear of consequences. Fear of what happens if the truth surfaces. And fear doesn't fade with time. It grows. As the breach finally began, tension reportedly spiked. Not because anyone expected something dramatic to leap out, but because of what the act symbolized. This was no longer about speculation. This was about confrontation. Tools met concrete. Slow. Controlled. Methodical. Every inch documented. Every sound amplified by the weight of expectation. And when the first opening was made, the air itself felt different. Stale. Trapped. That detail alone sent a quiet chill through the team. Because sealed spaces hold atmosphere. And atmosphere holds time. It told them this space hadn't been opened in a long while. Maybe never. Once access was widened enough to allow visual inspection, investigators reportedly paused. What they saw confirmed their suspicions. This wasn't random. This wasn't incidental. This was a room. A defined space. Walls. Floor. Ceiling. Purpose-built. And that realization hit harder than any object ever could. Because objects can be hidden anywhere. Rooms have to be planned. Built. Hidden in collaboration with others. No one builds a secret room alone. Even if only one person knows its purpose, others have to construct it. Engineers. Contractors. Workers. Which means silence had to be maintained. That opens the door to another layer of this story. Who else knew? Who helped create this space? And what did they think it was for? Sometimes people don't need to know the truth to be complicit. They just need to not ask questions. Money helps with that. So does authority. So does trust. Inside the space, investigators reportedly noted the same pattern they'd seen with the buried items. Order. Care. This wasn't a chaotic dumping ground. It was controlled. And that detail reinforced the growing belief that whatever this room was used for, it wasn't used once. It was maintained. Ask yourself, what kind of secret requires maintenance? Something you revisit. Something you manage. Something you check on. That possibility should unsettle you. Because it suggests continuity. Ongoing involvement. And if the room was used over time, then it wasn't just hiding the past. It was interacting with it. This is where the narrative becomes deeply uncomfortable. If a hidden room existed beneath the mansion, and if it was connected to the unresolved case investigators were revisiting, then the connection wasn't abstract. It was physical, concrete, real. It suggests proximity between the house and a mystery everyone thought belonged somewhere else. And proximity implies access. Access implies opportunity. Opportunity implies responsibility. Let me ask you this. How many secrets can a house hold before it starts to shape the people living above it? Living with a hidden space beneath your feet changes things. Even if you don't think about it consciously. Even if you tell yourself it's under control. Secrets seep. They influence behavior. They create tension. They turn homes into pressure cookers. And pressure cookers eventually explode. Investigators reportedly couldn't ignore the symbolic weight of the room. It represented more than concealment. It represented decision-making over time. Someone chose to build this. Someone chose to use it. Someone chose to keep it secret. Those choices don't exist in isolation. They ripple outward. They affect relationships. They create fear. And fear has consequences. As documentation continued, attention turned to subtle details inside the space. Marks. Impressions. Signs of past use. Nothing obvious enough to announce its purpose, but enough to suggest it wasn't empty for long stretches of time. That ambiguity is often worse than clarity, because it leaves room for imagination. And imagination fills gaps with possibilities that this space hadn't been accessed recently, which raises another question. If the room wasn't used in a long time, why go to such lengths to preserve it? Why not demolish it during later renovations? Why keep it intact? The answer investigators kept circling back to was uncomfortable. Because destruction is final, preservation keeps options open. As they began documenting the interior, patterns emerged that mirrored what had already been found underground. Order, deliberateness. Nothing here looked accidental or haphazard. Even the emptiness felt intentional. There were marks on the floor, faint impressions, not enough to definitively state what had been there, but enough to confirm that this room wasn't always empty. Something had occupied this space, something that required containment. Ask yourself this: why build a room you never planned to use? You don't. Which means at some point, this room served a function. And functions don't exist without purpose. The walls showed signs of reinforcement beyond what was structurally necessary. Not for weight, not for earthquakes, for isolation, sound dampening, stability. These are not features you add casually. They're features you add when privacy is essential, or when you don't want anyone to hear what's happening inside. That realization caused a shift in how investigators viewed everything that came before. The buried items, the unresolved case, the renovations. They weren't separate threads. They were part of the same design, and designs reveal intent. Here's where the emotional tension in the investigation deepened. If this room was connected to the long-forgotten case, then the case wasn't just revisited by chance. It had been physically embedded into the property. That's not coincidence. That's proximity. And proximity creates responsibility. At this stage, investigators reportedly debated how much to document before expanding the inquiry further. Not because they lacked authority, but because they understood what this discovery implied. A hidden room beneath a luxury mansion doesn't exist in a vacuum. It points outward, toward people, toward decisions, toward moments when someone chose concealment over accountability. Let me ask you directly. If you discovered a hidden room beneath your home that you didn't build, how would you react? Confusion? Fear? Denial? Or recognition? Recognition is the reaction no one wants to admit to. Because recognition implies knowledge, and knowledge implies involvement. As attention turned to who may have known about the room, investigators began reviewing renovation records more closely. Names of contractors, engineers, inspectors, anyone who might have been involved in altering the structure. And here's where another unsettling pattern emerged. The work was fragmented. Different phases, different crews. No single group responsible for the entire transformation. That fragmentation matters, because it minimizes the number of people who understand the full picture. It's a classic strategy. Divide the work, limit information, control who knows what. That way, no one person can expose the truth on their own. Silence through design. Ask yourself, who thinks like that? Not someone acting on impulse. Someone thinking long-term. Someone anticipating scrutiny. Someone preparing for a future where questions might be asked. This is where the idea of motive becomes unavoidable. Why go to such lengths? Why invest time, money, and effort into creating a space designed to disappear? Fear alone doesn't explain that level of planning. Fear combined with stakes does. High stakes. As investigators examined the room, they reportedly noticed subtle features that suggested repeated access at some point in the past. Not recent, but not ancient either. This wasn't a one-time use space. It was part of a routine. That realization is deeply unsettling, because routine implies normalization. It implies that whatever happened in or around this room was, at some point, considered manageable, controllable, acceptable enough to live with. That's how secrets survive. They become normalized. They get folded into daily life. They stop feeling dangerous until they are. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. How do you live above a secret like that? Do you think about it every day? Or do you train yourself not to? The human mind is remarkably good at compartmentalization, at placing terrifying truths in mental boxes and closing the lid. But boxes buried beneath your home don't stay sealed forever. They press upward. They influence mood, behavior, relationships. And when pressure builds long enough, something gives. This brings us back to the unresolved case. Because investigators began to see the room not just as a hiding place, but as a bridge between past and present. A physical manifestation of a secret that had never been resolved. The items buried nearby weren't random. They were placed where they could be protected by this space, which means the room wasn't just a container. It was an anchor. Anchors hold things in place. They keep them from drifting away. That metaphor mattered deeply to investigators, because it suggested that someone wanted to keep the past exactly where it was. Not forgotten. Contained. Ask yourself why someone would want that. Because the past, unresolved, is dangerous. It carries liability, exposure, consequences. And consequences don't care how much time has passed. As investigators prepared to move beyond documentation and into deeper analysis, another question loomed. Who benefited from this room remaining hidden? Not just emotionally, practically, financially, legally. Benefit reveals motive, and motive reveals direction. The existence of this room reframed the entire investigation. It suggested that the story everyone thought began with violence may have actually begun years earlier, with a decision to hide something instead of confronting it. That decision may have shaped everything that followed. Relationships, choices, silences, and eventually, consequences. Here's the part that should make you pause. If this room existed beneath the mansion, and if it was designed to hold secrets tied to an unresolved case, then the house wasn't just the setting of a tragedy. It was part of the mechanism that allowed that tragedy to unfold. Secrets don't just sit quietly. They exert force. They bend people around them. They create fault lines. And fault lines eventually crack. As the investigation moved forward, attention began to shift toward the people connected to the house. Not in an accusatory way, in an inevitable way. Because places don't build themselves. Rooms don't erase themselves. And secrets don't hide alone. Someone made this happen. Someone lived with it. And someone, at some point, lost control of it. As investigators prepared to follow that trail outward, away from concrete, and into human relationships, they understood one thing clearly. The room was only the beginning. Because uncovering it didn't answer the biggest question. It sharpened it. Why was this secret worth burying for so long? And what happens now that it's been found? Because once a hidden space is exposed, it doesn't just reveal the past. It destabilizes the present. And the next step in this story would force investigators to confront not just architecture, but people. People who may have known. People who may have helped. People who may have stayed silent. And that confrontation would prove far more dangerous than anything hidden beneath the mansion. What if the most dangerous part of this secret wasn't the room, but who knew it existed? That was the question investigators could no longer avoid once the hidden space was fully documented. Because concrete doesn't pour itself. Walls don't seal themselves. Rooms don't disappear without human hands guiding the process. And human hands mean human choices. This is where the investigation began to shift away from architecture and into something far more volatile. People. Let me ask you something. How many people does it take to keep a secret buried for years? Not dozens. Not hundreds. Sometimes just a few people choosing silence at the right moments. As soon as the existence of the hidden room was confirmed, investigators quietly expanded their scope. Not publicly, not dramatically, carefully, methodically. They started with records, renovation permits, inspection logs, contractor invoices. The boring paperwork no one pays attention to, unless they're looking for patterns. And patterns began to emerge. The renovations that created and concealed the room didn't happen all at once. They were staggered, spread across different periods, handled by different teams. At first glance, that looked chaotic. But on closer inspection, it looked strategic. Fragmentation reduces exposure. If no single contractor sees the entire project, no single contractor understands its true purpose. One team pours concrete. Another reinforces a wall. A third seals an access point. Everyone does their job. No one asks questions. That's not an accident. That's design. Ask yourself who benefits from that kind of fragmentation. Someone who understands risk. Someone who anticipates scrutiny. Someone who wants plausible deniability built directly into the process. Investigators began contacting individuals connected to past renovations. Some were cooperative. Some vague. Some claimed they barely remembered the work at all. Which, in itself, wasn't unusual. Years pass. Projects blur together. Except here's the contradiction. Several individuals remembered details they shouldn't have remembered, while claiming to forget the details that mattered. That kind of selective memory always raises eyebrows. Because people forget randomly. They don't forget strategically. This is where the emotional temperature of the investigation began to rise. Not because anyone had been accused yet, but because silence started to feel intentional. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. If you were hired to work on a high-end property and were told not to ask questions, would you? Probably not. Money has a way of encouraging compliance. So does authority. So does the assumption that someone else has handled the paperwork. That's how secrets move through systems without ever being spoken aloud. Investigators reportedly noticed that some contractors had been instructed to work unusual hours, short windows, limited access, specific tasks without context. Again, not illegal, but not typical either. And when these details were layered together, a picture started to form, not of a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but of a controlled environment. An environment where information was carefully managed, where curiosity was discouraged, where silence was rewarded. And that brings us to the people who lived above the room. Because no matter how carefully construction is managed, you can't erase awareness entirely. Someone had to approve the work. Someone had to pay for it. Someone had to live with the knowledge that something beneath their home didn't officially exist. That knowledge changes people. It creates tension. It shapes behavior. It influences decisions in subtle ways that don't show up on blueprints. Investigators reportedly began revisiting interviews conducted early in the case. Statements that seemed straightforward at the time now felt different. Hesitations, carefully chosen words. Answers that addressed one question while sidestepping another. Those details had been easy to dismiss before. Now they felt significant. Ask yourself this. How do you talk about a house when you know part of it is a lie? You avoid specifics. You generalize. You redirect. You focus on what's visible. And that's exactly what investigators began to notice. Descriptions of the property tended to stay surface level. Public areas, known rooms, shared spaces. Anything beneath the surface remained abstract, unspoken. This wasn't proof of guilt, but it was evidence of awareness. And awareness is powerful, because awareness means choice. Choice to speak, choice to stay silent, choice to maintain the secret. This is where the emotional contradictions deepened. On one hand, there was genuine shock surrounding the violence that brought law enforcement to the property. Grief, confusion, disbelief. On the other hand, there was a quiet familiarity with secrecy. Those two realities can coexist. People can be devastated by one event while still carrying the weight of another. Human psychology is complicated that way. Investigators reportedly wrestled with how to approach this phase. Because once you move from places to people, the stakes change. Questions become personal. Answers have consequences. And cooperation becomes unpredictable. This is where fear enters the equation. Fear of exposure. Fear of implication. Fear of realizing that silence itself may carry consequences. Let me ask you something else. If you knew about a secret that suddenly became relevant again, how would you react? Would you volunteer information? Or would you hope it stayed buried? Hope is not a strategy, but it's a common response. As interviews continued, investigators reportedly noticed that some individuals reacted strongly to specific details. Not the violence, not the arrest. The room. That reaction mattered. Because people don't react emotionally to things they don't understand. They react to things they recognize. Recognition is the tell no one can fully hide. At this stage, investigators weren't looking for confessions. They were looking for inconsistencies, gaps between what people said and what the structure of the house suggested. And those gaps were growing. Let me ask you directly. If a hidden room existed beneath your home and you knew about it, would you mention it when investigators asked about the property? Most people would, unless there was a reason not to. And reasons not to talk are rarely innocent. This is where the investigation began to feel like a pressure cooker. No accusations yet, just questions. And questions have weight, especially when the answers start circling around the same omissions. Investigators reportedly began to suspect that the secret of the room wasn't held by one person alone. It was distributed, fragmented, shared in pieces. That makes secrets harder to expose, but it also makes them more fragile, because all it takes is one person breaking ranks. One moment of fear outweighing loyalty. One realization that silence is no longer protection. And silence becomes harder to maintain when evidence exists. Physical evidence. Concrete evidence. Rooms don't lie. They sit there, waiting. And the longer they sit, the more pressure they exert on the people who know they're there. This is where the unresolved case re-enters the story in a new way. Because investigators began to see the room not just as a hiding place, but as a shared burden. A thing that multiple people had learned to live with. And living with a burden changes relationships. It creates alliances. It creates tension. It creates fractures. Some people cope by denial. Others by control. Others by desperation. And desperation leads to mistakes. Ask yourself this. What happens when a secret you thought was under control suddenly isn't? You scramble. You reassess. You make decisions under pressure. And decisions under pressure are rarely clean. As investigators prepared to widen their inquiry beyond the immediate circle of the household, they understood one thing. The hidden room had done more than conceal objects. It had shaped human behavior for years. And those behaviors were now under scrutiny. Because once a secret space is exposed, everyone connected to it has to answer the same question. What did you know? And when did you know it? Those questions don't stay contained. They ripple outward. Toward families. Toward associates. Toward anyone who might have been close enough to notice something was off. And as that ripple began to spread, investigators sensed something shifting. Not resistance, but fear. The kind of fear that tells you the truth is closer than people want it to be. Because when fear changes tone, it means someone understands that the story is no longer theirs to control. And that's the moment when long-held secrets start to crack. The room beneath the mansion had been silent for years. But now, it was forcing conversations no one wanted to have. And the next phase of this investigation wouldn't focus on what was buried underground. It would focus on who had lived above it. And why they chose silence. Because silence, in the face of truth, isn't neutral. It's a decision. And decisions always have consequences. What if the most unsettling discovery wasn't beneath the mansion at all, but above it? By this point, investigators had mapped the hidden room, cataloged the buried items, cross-referenced decades-old cases. And now, they had to confront a more uncomfortable reality. The people who had lived in the mansion all these years. Not just occupants, but those who had known, suspected, or participated, directly or indirectly, in keeping the secrets intact. Because a hidden room can only influence so much. The true pressure comes from those aware of its existence. Let me ask you something. How do you live above a secret that could destroy everything you've built? That could unravel your family, your career, your reputation? That forces you to make choices every day between honesty and self-preservation? Some people cope with silence. Others manipulate it. Some simply bury it deeper, hoping it will never be discovered. But silence is a living thing. It grows. It pressures. And eventually, it demands attention. Investigators began focusing on behavior. Not overt actions. There were too few, but patterns. Small inconsistencies in statements. Hesitations during questioning. Recollections that didn't align. People remembered certain details vividly while failing to recall what mattered most. Some avoided the topic entirely. Others shifted conversations to trivial aspects of the property, the renovation process, or general memories of the family, as if avoiding the truth could erase it. But avoidance is fragile. Gaps show. Misalignment surfaces. And investigators noticed that several household members had inconsistencies between what they reported and what the evidence suggested. Consider this. If the room had existed for years, someone had to authorize its creation. Someone had to be aware that objects would be stored there. Someone had to live with the knowledge that pieces of a long-forgotten case were literally beneath their feet. That knowledge changes a person. It changes relationships. It affects daily decisions. And it shapes behavior in ways that are often subtle, almost imperceptible, until you start looking closely. Investigators began reviewing financial records, property documents, and communications surrounding the renovations. They discovered patterns of expenditure that were unusual but justifiable on the surface. Contractors were paid in segments, at times that didn't coincide with standard work hours. Materials were purchased in smaller batches. Some communications hinted at urgency, but not the urgency associated with ordinary construction work. It was the urgency of secrecy. Here's where the contradictions became psychologically tense. People involved had acted with foresight and discretion. Yet, when questioned, their reactions suggested emotional stress inconsistent with just following instructions. Investigators interpreted this as an implicit acknowledgement that there was more.